Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Buckeye Weekly Podcast. I'm Tony Gerdeman here, as always, with Tom. Tom, how's it going?
Well, Tony, on today's show, the question is, how will the Ohio State offense attack Michigan's defense? And Tony, I can save you. The TLDR here is, it depends who's playing, because boy, that feels like that sort of changes the answer to this question quite a bit.
And yet, even without knowing who's going to play, if it's only one of Carnell Tate and Jeremiah Smith, or if it's none, I still think you have to attack Michigan through the air. And we'll get to that. I think maybe we should just start at the line of scrimmage as we talk about the Ohio State offense versus the Michigan defense and how best to attack things. I continue to say if you just protect Julian Sain, you'll be okay. And you're protecting him from some pretty decent pass rushers. We talked about Derek Moore back in the 5 Wolverines to be concerned about show and how he can get his sacks in bunches and just show up and like let other people do so much for the first 45 minutes of a game. And then he's like, okay, I'm done watching. I'm going to go do my thing. And he's got 9.5 sacks on the season. He's got 4 games with multiple sacks. So when we say they come in bunches, that's not an exaggeration. And so when he's matched up with Phillip Daniels or Austin Seerveld, that's a battle that Ohio State needs to win and win throughout the game. Because whenever Derek Moore has a knack for just at the end of the game, at the worst time, he's going to get that sack. So if Ohio State wins that battle, I feel pretty good about their chances in this one.
Yeah, the Michigan defense doesn't have quite the difference makers they had in the interior of the defensive line last year. It felt like last year the conversation with the defensive line went inside out. This year it's kind of outside in. And yeah, Derek Moore and Jayshon Barham really are the two guys to really know on the outside. We've talked about TJ Guy, and it feels like we've seen a lot less of him this year. And they've got other guys they'll sort of rotate through there at the defensive end positions. But yeah, I think Derek Moore is kind of the most well-rounded of their defensive ends this year. Number 8, he is, again, you'll see him, he'll flash. You won't see him, and then all of a sudden, boom, there he is. And it's like sometimes it's 2 sacks on the same drive. If Ohio State, that's one of those individual battles. You do this series during the season or the summer every year, counting down to the season, and it's always, these individual player battles. Ohio State's tight end versus Michigan's linebacker or whatever it is. A corner against a wide receiver. Individual battle to watch. This feels like one of those real individual battle, as you said. Whether it's Phillip Daniels, whether it's Austin Seerveld against those guys. If Ohio State can win those individual battles, that alone probably makes a very big difference in terms of what this offense looks like. Because if you can run the ball, if you can kind of get the, set the edge for, as an offense, set the edge for your running back, or if you can just give Julian Sain time, that feels like that's going to be a real game changer for the Ohio State offense. Because Michigan probably has to get to Julian Sain. Because we'll get to their secondary in a little bit, but I don't think their secondary is one where you just kind of go, yeah, Michigan will be able to hold their own there with no problems. They've had problems, like they've had big problems in the secondary this year against wide receivers and offenses that are not as good as Ohio State's, and they've gotten away with some stuff against wide receivers and offenses that are not as good as Ohio State. So, if you have Jeremiah Smith and or Carnell Tate playing, that is going to be probably one of the biggest battles individually anywhere on the field is sort of those edge rushers versus Ohio State's tackles.
Moving inside, you mentioned the fact that Michigan lost their top two defensive tackles, and they're still pretty darn good against the run. What they aren't necessarily doing much of is penetrating, making tackles for loss in the backfield. Their defensive tackles in the Big Ten have 5 tackles for loss. All like they play 4. They'll rotate 4. They've started the same 2 all season long in Trey Pierce and Rayshon Benny, but they'll also rotate in Trey Williams and Damon Payne. But in Big Ten play, all 4 of those guys have combined for 5 tackles for loss. And Caden McDonald, Ohio State's starting nose tackle, has 6 tackles for loss by himself in Big Ten play, to give you an idea. So it's a big step down from what they had last year in terms of playmaking on the interior. So I feel like that's That's an area where Ohio State can take advantage of the situation. And that's why I do think Ohio State can run the ball. I'm not saying, hey, if you run the ball, you'll win the game, Tom. That's a you thing. I'm saying I think there's an avenue here for Ohio State to have an advantage at the line of scrimmage. Can they run it consistently for 4 quarters? I don't know. Probably not, because they haven't against their best defenses. I do think they're getting better. But Michigan will rotate guys, so they stay fresh. And the defensive tackles are big. They get in the way, but they're not necessarily making a bunch of plays. So I feel like, Carson Hinsman, Luke Montgomery on the left side of things can maybe do some things. Maybe things won't go so well on the right side. So maybe this becomes a left-handed offense, although you can't be too predictable either.
Right. And I do think the left side of Ohio State's offensive line has been better than the right side of the offensive line pretty consistently throughout the year. It does merit mentioning that, boy, no one was talking about Tabor Shabola after the Rutgers game. And that's probably indicative of the fact that was one of Tabor Shabola's better games at right guard for Ohio State. And Philip Daniels, I think, had one of his better games. But the Rutgers defensive front is also not nearly as good as the Michigan defensive front. So we'll see how that translates. But there were some encouraging signs just in terms of how they're picking up twists and stunts and all that kind of stuff. You'll see a bunch of that from Michigan. And Ohio State has, it seems like, done a better job IDing and dealing with those kind of things in recent weeks. So that's sort of encouraging for Ohio State. And I don't want people to think Michigan's defensive tackles are bad. Michigan's defensive tackles are good. They're just not A+ great. A1A, as Urban Meyer used to say. They're good this year, but they're not incredible best players on the field kind of great like they were last year. So that's a little bit of a change. I don't think Ohio State clearly wins the battle in the trenches. I think if Ohio State can just play it to a stalemate, that's probably fine. And I think Ohio State probably can play it to a stalemate. This is not going to look like Ohio State running the ball against Rutgers or Michigan running the ball against Maryland last week, where you had offensive linemen just blowing the defensive front off the ball. It's not going to look like that. But if Ohio State can just run the ball for 4 yards a carry, and I think that's reasonable. I'm not thinking this is going to be 6-7 yards a carry like they got last week. What was it, 6.9 or something like that against Rutgers? 6.7. Yeah, it wasn't. They're not going to do that by any means, unless you rip off some big ones, which is possible. We'll get to Michigan secondary in a minute, but I don't think they're going to be able to consistently run the ball for 5-6 yard chunks. If they can run the ball for 4 yards a carry, that's probably enough for Ohio State to win. Because I think, if Ohio State and Michigan both run the ball for 4 yards a carry, I think Ohio State wins the game. Because I think Ohio State can do enough other stuff, especially if they're running the ball consistently like that. They can do enough stuff off of that to win the game in the passing game and other places. But yeah, I think that's 4 yards a carry, I think, is a reasonable target for Ohio State. I'm sure the goal would be 4.5, 5, but if they end up in that 4-ish, 4.2 kind of yards per carry, that's probably enough for Ohio State.
Well, I think you're right there. And Michigan's only allowed more than 3.5 yards per carry, 3.55, 3.6 yards per carry just once, and that was USC. USC went off on them for 224 yards, 6.2 yards per carry.
That was a lot of long runs, right? That was that third string true freshman running back, King, whatever his name was, coming in.
King Mac.
Ripping off some long ones. It probably skewed the numbers a little bit, but again, that's what I'm talking about. Like, consistently, they were probably running in that 4-ish yards per carry, and then you had the 40-yarder or whatever it was that sort of bumped the average up there.
And then you had Oklahoma, their other loss, 40 carries, 138 yards, 3.45 yards per carry, but 74 of those yards were John Mateer, the quarterback. And you're not going to get that from Julian Sand unless he rips off an 86-yarder, which is totally possible. But overall, they've done very well against the run. They've given Michigan State rushed for 115 yards, Purdue rushed for 138, and those are two of the 4 best performances by an opposing offense so far this year. So they've only given up over 100 yards those 4 times, and they've lost 2 of them. So maybe that's a target right now for Ohio State. Get to 135, 140 yards rushing, and you got to feel pretty good about the fact that it's going to be up for grabs in the fourth quarter. Would Ohio State feel good about that? No, but in terms of like, if you want to win, you don't need to rush for 220 yards. I think Oklahoma did it with 138. USC did it with 224. There are ways to do this that don't require the 224 yards and the home runs that USC hit. However, Ohio State's clicking right now, and we can say, well, it's the opponents that they've played. I'm not expecting 256 yards or whatever they rushed for last week this week, but they are doing better, and the running backs are looking better. I think there's an avenue here, Tom, for them to run the ball against Michigan.
Yeah, I think they can run the ball against Michigan. I don't think they're going to win the game solely by running the ball against Michigan. They're not going to run the ball over Michigan, but they can run the ball against Michigan well enough to open things up in the passing game. That feels like where this is probably headed in terms of Ohio State's offensive approach, is run the ball well enough to keep Michigan honest, and then that opens up. You're gonna really hit your big plays potentially in the passing game rather than the run game, but the run game helps you get there in the pass game.
And so as we move past the defensive front, we move to the linebackers. Ernest Hausman, their starting middle linebacker, did not play last week. He may play this week, kind of up near Cole Sullivan. Stepped in for him, really talented young player. Jimmy Rolder has been the other linebacker starting since Jayshawn Barham moved to the edge and after the first game. So those three guys, really, Hausman is a total veteran, and he's been around forever. Started his career at Nebraska, where he's a tackling machine as a true freshman, then moved to Michigan. Sullivan and Rolder, they have the football nose. They find the football. They'll find if the ball gets tipped in the air, there's a pretty good chance Cole Sullivan's going to come down with it somehow. Like, what's he doing over there? Who knows? He's out of position, but the ball finds him. Jimmy Rolder, I think, they can attack these guys through the air. I think we've seen tight ends. We talked about it in a recent show. The tight ends for Ohio State and the tight ends for most of Michigan's opponents this year have had success catching the ball and have good days, have had some of their best days catching the ball. Ohio State with Carnell Tate, Jeremiah Smith, regardless, they've got some good tight ends. Max Clare could be in for a big day against these linebackers. Tom, when you look at the Michigan linebacker situation, where do you see things as it stands for the Ohio State offense against them?
I think Michigan's linebackers are solid this year. I don't think, we listed two of them in our, players who are maybe dangerous to Ohio State show a couple days ago. And I think those are, they're solid guys. They're smart players. They're in the right place. You have the sort of son of a coach sort of traditional model of player. And both of those guys sort of fit that, where they're just kind of always in the right place. A little bit of a, sort of Caleb Downs nose for the football kind of thing. But you also, this is also a defense that, as you said, there's vulnerabilities there. I think those guys are probably better against the run than they are against the pass. And I am looking at this as, we saw the Max Clare game last week where he had over 100 yards receiving for Ohio State. A lot of this is going to be predicated on our Carnell Tate and Jeremiah Smith playing, because if they are, well, then that, potentially that means a lot more passes are going their direction, but it also means you might see a lot of Max Clare running open down the seam. Like, you might see a lot of that in this game. And Clare had a touchdown last week. He had a number of nice catches, just sort of, nothing complicated, just a bunch of drag routes and that kind of stuff. Michigan's going to play a lot of zone, and they really don't play a lot of man coverage. So you're going to see a lot of zone. If you're predictable like that, and, obviously they're going to mix zone coverages, but there are going to be opportunities, and third down, Wink Martindale is going to bring a lot of pressure. You'll see cover zero out of Wink Martindale in third down situations. That's where you might see a seam shot to Max Clare that goes for a long gain. And, those linebackers they're solid, but they're also athletically, they're not Arvell Reese or Sonny Styles athletically. They're smart, but they're probably well above average in terms of the linebackers that Ohio State has faced this year, but they're also not freakish athletes by any means. So it's going to be an area where Michigan's going to be solid, but Ohio State's certainly going to have some opportunities.
Could also see it's been maybe a little while since we've seen Ohio State use the running backs in the passing game as much as they were doing it more in the earlier in the season, and just dumping it off to Bo Jackson or Isaiah West, and it's a kind of just an easy 15 yards right up the middle as an outlet. I wonder if we see more of that this week, and maybe try to find some situations where they are. And you mentioned a lot of zone. Despite that zone, we still see this Michigan secondary got deep, or the opportunity to get gotten deep, where receivers will run by Jair Hill and Zeke Berry, and safeties can't necessarily, even if they're playing cover two or they're playing, whatever, like they can't necessarily get back there to help. And so when you look at this secondary, which has started 5 different safeties this year, I know people have mentioned, Rod Moore. I don't know anything about in terms of, is he even an option at this point? And even if he plays, there's going to be so much rust because it's been a while since he's been out there. He last started a game at USC, so that was 6 games ago. And so, like, even if he's back, what's he going to give you? And he's the guy that with the nose for the ball as well at safety. He's just really, really good player. I'm not factoring him into this, even if he's really playing, because again, it's been a while. And Brandon Hillman, Jaden Mangum, TJ Metcalf, Mason Curtis, like they're all, and TJ Metcalf is their nickel. There's just, I said it before, there's just a bunch of strong safeties, and their ability to play center field is lacking. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see when you see these cornerbacks get beaten deep, there's really no safety in the picture most of the time. And maybe that's because it's the cover 0 and it's blitz or cover 1, and there's nobody on that side. When I watch these corners all year long, and we said it in Michigan Monday show, every week we've got notes about Jair Hill getting beat, Zeke Berry getting beat deep. There's a way to win this game where you don't need to run the ball that much. You just need to hit the 4 shots that come open. If you hit 3 of the 4 shots that come open, you've got a pretty good opportunity, because Maryland had 2 or 3 shots that would have been touchdowns if they connected, and they didn't. And if Michigan gives Ohio State that kind of opportunity with all of their other weapons offensively, that's going to be lights out for Michigan.
Yeah, this feels like a game where Michigan needs to keep the score probably in the low 20s at the most to win the game, and maybe even in the teens, just because I don't know that Michigan's offense is going to be able to do that much against the Ohio State defense. And so it only takes a couple big hits for Ohio State to, if Ohio State somehow gets up 14 points, Michigan is in a bad place, because then it's, then you get to the point where how much can you run the ball? Do you need to throw the ball more? And that's, we'll get to that on the Michigan offense side of the version of this show. But if Ohio State gets up, that gets Michigan out of what Michigan wants to do on offense. And that's where things could potentially really spiral for them. Michigan has to keep Ohio State. Michigan needs a lot of Ohio State kicking field goals. I think you may see them try and play field position and try and pin Ohio State back, which then limits what Ohio State can do. We saw that work very effectively for Michigan this time last year. But I think that this is a game where Michigan, if you tell me how many 30-yard passes or 40-yard passes Ohio State hits, boy, that tells me a lot about how this game goes. Because if they hit 3 of those, maybe 3 long ones, boy, that probably puts Ohio State in a position where they're at least kicking field goals at the very least, and probably scoring at least a couple touchdowns. And if they score 3 touchdowns, they're probably going to win this game. That puts Ohio State in a pretty decent spot. So it feels like there's a lot of opportunities. There's a lot more paths to victory for Ohio State than there probably are for Michigan. I was, while you were talking, I was looking up Rod Moore's stats for this year. He's played in 3 games: 1 tackle against Nebraska on September 20th, 1 tackle against Wisconsin on October 4th, 4 tackles against USC on October 11th. That's it. End of list. And he's someone that, if he was healthy and he was playing, that would be, that would really materially change my opinion on what this might look like on Saturday. But if you haven't played for a month and a half, this is not the game you want to be throwing him back out there and, saying good luck. Not that he's not mentally ready, but just physically, that's a big adjustment, and you're getting thrown into the deep end of the pool. And you said something in one of the earlier shows this week that I thought was a good observation. It just feels like Michigan. Sorry to say something vaguely complimentary of you. I'll never do it again. Michigan has a lot of strong safeties, and they don't really have a true free safety center fielder on this team. And you watch plays, and it's just a lot of times just the ball skills of some of the safety play and even the corner play is just you'll see guys sort of lose track of the ball or overrun plays, and just that's the kind of stuff you can't have against Ohio State. You can get away with that to a certain degree against Northwestern because they're not going to make those catches, or against Maryland because they're going to overthrow it or they're not going to make those catches. If you don't have good ball skills and you're trying to defend Julian Sand to Jeremiah Smith or Julian Sand to Carnell Tate, whatever it is, that's where stuff you have gotten away with in the past will catch up with you.
It's interesting as we wrap up here. Michigan's defense has given up 33 20-yard passes or more, which is 16th in the Big Ten. Only Rutgers and Purdue are worse. However, those 33 passes have only turned into 9 30-yard completions, which is 5th in the Big Ten, tied with Penn State and Indiana and Illinois. And they've only given up 2 40-yard passes, which is tied for lowest in the Big Ten with your Ohio State Buckeyes out there, people. So I would be, frankly, a little surprised at that number, but based on watching Michigan all year long and seeing how many bad quarterbacks they have played, like, there are opportunities for some big hits out there. For whatever reason, pressure, just not quite having enough time, or just having an inaccurate quarterback, they've gotten away with it. Ohio State can't let them get away with it. It's the Jesse Pinkman, they can't keep getting away with it type of thing here for Ohio State. So you've got to allow Julian Sand to step into his throws in order to make those 20-yarders, those 30-yarders turn into something more. Because, again, I can't keep writing this down every single week. Did it last year, writing it down every single week, and you don't see it taken advantage of. There's opportunities there. You just got to give Julian Sand time. And I'm going to be interested to see how he does against the blitz and the pressure and what's it like. What's the situation in the fourth quarter? He's not yet faced that. If it's tight, how is he operating? So I think that's also something we'll probably talk more about. But any last thoughts on the Ohio State offense before we run?
Well, I will tell you, I have already recorded this week's Ohio State offense show with Ross Fulton, who is our X's and O's guy at Buckeye Huddle. That will go up a little later on Tuesday. It is already up for our members at BuckeyeHuddle.com. It is one of the best shows I think he and I have ever done. It is, and let me be extremely clear about who gets all the credit for that. It is not me. It is one of the people on the show. It is not me. It's also not Tony, no matter what Tony wants to say. Ross did a really phenomenal job breaking down some of the plays to sort of watch from the Ohio State Rutgers game, but also looking at some of the stuff that Michigan is going to try and do in coverage against Ohio State. He's going to talk a lot about the concept Zeus, and it's something that they have sort of tried to do against Ohio State, even going back to when Mike McDonald was the defensive coordinator, all kind of off that Vic Fangio kind of tree. But he did a great job with that. Again, that is already up for our members at BuckeyeHuddle.com. That'll be up a little later on Tuesday for everyone on YouTube. So I think you guys will really enjoy that, and we'll definitely learn a lot from that. Every time I talk to Ross, I feel like I get a little bit smarter about this stuff. So I think you guys will really enjoy that one as well.
So there you go. We are about out of here. If you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and hit the thumbs up. We'd appreciate that. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell to be notified. As you've noticed, we're dropping a bunch of content for this week for good reason. And, of course, doing the same over at BuckeyeHuddle.com. Sign up now. Become a member. Say hello to us there on the Buckeye Huddle message board presented by Jeff Ruby's Columbus. So that will do it for right now. Thank you all for tuning in, and we will talk to you all later.